Chapter 11. Tendencies to Fascism in Western Europe and America. Until the last few years, liberalism and social democracy denied the possibility of fascism in the, quote, civilized countries of Western Europe and America. As early as 1922, immediately after the victory of fascism in Italy, while current discussions still treated this as a, quote, Italian phenomenon, the Communist International at its Fourth Congress gave the warning for every country, quote, the menace of fascism lurks today in many countries, in Czechoslovakia, in Hungary, in nearly all the Balkan countries, in Poland, in Germany, Bavaria, in Austria and America, and even in countries like Norway. Fascism in one form or another is not altogether impossible, even in countries like France and England, unquote. But even as late as 1928, the Second International still clung to its theory of the, quote, two Europes, and of, quote, dictatorship as being only possible in, quote, backward countries. Van der Velde, chairman of the Second International, declared at its Brussels Congress in 1928, quote, a great captain of industry recently said to us, quote, if without taking into account political frontiers, you trace an imaginary line from Kovno to Bilbao, passing through Krakow and Florence, you will find before you two Europes, the one in which horsepower dominates, the other where it is the living horse, the one where there are parliaments, the other where there are dictators, unquote. It is in reality exclusively in the latter economically and politically backward Europe that dictatorships more or less brutal, more or less hypocritical, abound, whether veiled or no by a sham national representation, unquote. 3 years later, in 1931, the Second International had to admit the incorrectness of this theory. In its report to the Vienna Congress in 1931, the executive declared, quote, fascism has overstepped the limits which but a few years previously appeared to be drawn for it by the development of modern technique, whereas it was believed at the time that fascism was confined to those countries in which, quote, instead of horsepower, the living horse dominates. The fascist danger has now also penetrated to countries in which industry is highly developed, unquote. And commenting, look back to an earlier chapter about fascism and advanced technique. Chapter 1 of this book is actually called Technique and Revolution, and the section titles are The Growth of the Productive Forces, The Conflict of the Productive Forces Against Existing Society, Productivity and Unemployment, and The Alternative, Social Revolution or Destruction. It's also discussed in chapters 2 and 3, with chapter 3 discussing the destruction of the productive forces, the revolt against the machine, the revolt against science, etc. So the Social Democrats were very wrong here, and Dutt was able to trace in this book the link between advanced production techniques and deeper crises of capitalism, and hence the development of fascism. But yeah, this completely conflicts with the entire anti-revolutionary reformist idea of social democrats that basically capitalism will just get better and better, more orderly rather than less orderly, and that gradually social democratic politicians and their mass movements can just sort of take over the reins. So that's fundamentally flawed. Anyway, continuing. The 3 further years since 1931 have seen the establishment of complete fascist dictatorships in Germany and Austria, the growth of influentially supported fascist movements in France and England, the development of the Spanish Revolution to the point of extreme menace of fascism, and the first signs of semi-fascist movements and tendencies. There's a footnote there about the Spanish Revolution. The question of Spain, which is basically different in type from the leading Western imperialist countries, is not further dealt with in this chapter. Any treatment would require a detailed separate analysis of the whole development of the Spanish Revolution since 1931. Its strangling by the left democratic liberal socialist bloc at the time of the height of the mass revolutionary wave, and the consequent passing of power to the right and rapid growth of fascism, approaching the prospect of an intense struggle of fascism and the mass movement in the coming period. Since the publication of the first edition of this book, these issues have come to a head in the Civil War, which broke out in Spain in October 1934. Back to the main text. It is now clear to all that the theory of fascism as a phenomenon only of, quote, backward, quote, agrarian countries is false, and that the communist analysis of fascism as the characteristic instrument of finance capital, which can be brought into play in the most highly developed industrial countries when the stage of the crisis and of the class struggle requires it, has been proved correct by facts. Events daily and hourly reinforce the truth that the international working class throughout the world, in every capitalist country, has to fight the menace of fascism. Another footnote here, the corresponding revision of fascist expression, from the time when Mussolini declared that, quote, fascism is not an article for export, to the time when Mussolini declared, 1930, that fascism is, quote, universal, okay, and looks forward to a, quote, fascist Europe, has accompanied but has not caused this development. Apart from the interchanges between fascist movements, the attempts of fascism at rudimentary forms of international propaganda are still, inevitably from the very nature of fascism, feeble so far. Comment, why feeble so far? Because by its nature, fascism is hyper-nationalist. We still see this expressed today in the, quote, anti-globalist movement, and in the next line, continuing, a journal, Anti-Europa, is issued from Rome with the subtitle, Review of Fascist Expansion Throughout the World, and while mainly Italian, has printed contributions from Hitler, Mosley, and others. There is also the similar journal, Ottobre. The wording of the official announcement of Anti-Europa from the issue of September 30, 1933, containing an article by Mosley on modern dictatorship and British history, is worth reproducing as a curiosity. Quote, our organ is really the world centrum of fascist intelligence, contradiction in terms, furthers extension, illustrates relationship, and controls the fascist intelligence development in the world. The means of propaganda is the Anti-Europa Monthly Review, and Ottobre, the paper of the Universal Fascism, capital U, documentate yourselves by means of Nuova Europa, unquote. The striking English of this effusion is sufficiently revealing of the very weak, quote, international basis of this attempt of Italian fascism to figure as a, quote, world centrum. Back to the main text. Section 1. The basis for fascism in Britain, the United States, and France. In 1890, William Morris, in his penetrating imaginative anticipation of the process of the social revolution in Britain, given in his News from Nowhere, Chapter 17, How the Change Came, wrote, quote, whatever the government might do, a great part of the upper and middle classes were determined to set on foot a counter-revolution, for the communism which now loomed ahead seemed quite unendurable to them. Bands of young men, like the marauders in the Great Strike of whom I told you just now, armed themselves and drilled, and began on any opportunity or pretense to skirmish with the people in the streets. The government neither helped them nor put them down, but stood by, hoping that something might come of it. These friends of order, as they were called, had some successes at first and grew bolder. They got many officers of the regular army to help them, and by that means laid hold of munitions of war of all kinds. A sort of irregular war was carried on with varied success all over the country. And at last the government, which at first pretended to ignore the struggle, or treat it as mere rioting, definitely declared for the Friends of Order, unquote. And commenting, we see a similar thing today with the various neo-fascist vigilante groups like the Proud Boys and others, also the far-right paramilitary groups, many of whom got their training from the U.S. military doing anti-communist and colonial wars. Now their services extend to periods of crisis for capitalism, such as the sustained post-2008 social upheavals, which are likely to continue and increase in intensity. Continuing, the poet of late 19th century Britain, whose insight was strengthened above his contemporaries of literature by his acceptance of the standpoint of revolutionary Marxism and direct participation in the mass struggle, here comes remarkably close to a forecast of fascism. This passage is of interest, not only as one of the earliest direct anticipations of the specific character of fascism, not merely of counter-revolution in general in revolutionary socialist literature, but also precisely because it sprang from observation of British conditions and experience of the struggle in Britain, while the blind liberals and reformists 3 decades later, with facts staring them in the face, were still to be proclaiming fascism, quote, alien and, quote, unthinkable in Britain. It was precisely the observation of British conditions that first awoke in a keen mind, which had drawn nourishment from Marxism, one of the earliest direct anticipations of fascism. The illusion of the alien character of fascism in the, quote, democratic countries of Western Europe and America is commonly presented as based on the supposed peculiarities and uniqueness of the, quote, national character and, quote, institutions in these countries. Britain, or alternatively, according to the speaker, the United States, or France, quote, will never tolerate fascism. It is foreign to our whole traditions and outlook, unquote. The same myth was also current in Germany, where up to the last, the formula that Germany is not Italy was unweariedly repeated. What underlies the conception of the, quote, different character of Western Europe and America, and the undoubted fact of the deeper rooting of parliamentary democratic institutions in these countries? In reality, the situation, and the ideology accompanying it, is only the reflection of the wealthier, more powerful, privileged situation of Western imperialism with its vast colonial possessions and world domination. The earlier accession to power of the bourgeoisie in these countries brought parliamentary institutions, the instrument of their fight against feudalism, earlier to the front, and these parliamentary institutions continued to be maintained after the fight against feudalism was fully completed and the serious meaning had fully gone out of them, for the deception of the working class and the camouflage of the real rule of the narrowing plutocracy. Wow, so what's a narrowing plutocracy? Plutocracy is ruled by the rich, and narrowing means that the rich as a group are getting smaller. So in other words, what he's saying is that the parliament once was a serious weapon in the bourgeoisie's struggle against feudalism. But after the forces of feudalism were overcome, it really ceased to have that meaning. And now they just keep it around, not to fight feudalism, but to keep the workers in line by dangling this false hope that it can be an instrument of serious proletarian power. Continuing, the strength and resources of capitalism in these metropolitan countries made it possible to pursue a liberal policy of concessions to the workers, and thus to draw the working class in the wake of capitalism and hinder the growth of independent class consciousness. Hence the long domination of liberal and social reformist politics in the working class in Britain, France, and the United States right into the 20th century and 21st century, and the slow growth of class-conscious socialism in contrast to Central and Eastern Europe, and hence the solid basis for the longer, successful maintenance of parliamentary institutions of deception in these countries, when these same institutions, transferred to other countries, could find little root. The, quote, democratic freedoms of Western imperialism have been built on the foundation of colonial slavery, as was strikingly demonstrated when the Labour government, the champion of, quote, democracy, brought in a reign of terror to maintain despotism in India and jailed 60,000 for the crime of asking for democratic rights. But just this basis of parliamentary democratic institutions in the Western imperialist countries is increasingly undermined by the crisis of capitalism. The monopoly of the world market breaks down, the colonies revolt, the world tribute diminishes, the bourgeoisie in the metropolitan countries is compelled, in place of concessions and reforms, to withdraw those already granted and launch ever-increasing attacks on the workers. But this inevitably brings a new intensity of the class struggle in these countries, and a widening revolutionary awakening of the working class. Comment, for example, witnessed the last few decades of neoliberal austerity regimes which have been tearing apart the social safety net, those concessions that were part of the golden age of social democracy, particularly since the global financial crisis of 2008, and then the subsequent resurgence of the left, albeit still embryonic. Continuing, for a period, the apparatus of laborism still serves to canalize the discontent of the workers and keep them attached to capitalism. But laborism is compelled by the crisis increasingly to expose itself and assist the capitalist offensive against the workers, and disillusionment grows. As the situation develops, the bourgeoisie is compelled to look to new forms to maintain its rule. The movement of bourgeois policy begins to turn away from the exhausted and discredited parliamentarism toward open dictatorship, toward fascism. This movement, after developing first in the more poverty-stricken and backward countries, reaches its first major imperialist state in Germany, the power which has been stripped of its colonies and weakened in its world imperialist position, and only finally begins to develop in the dominant imperialist powers, Britain, France, and the United States, and their satellites, Scandinavia, Belgium, Holland, Switzerland. But as soon as this situation develops, it becomes clear that fascism, so far from being alien to the Western imperialist states, has an extremely strong potential basis in their whole social, economic, and political structure. What are the general conditions favoring the growth of fascism? They may be briefly enumerated. 1. Intensification of the economic crisis and the class struggle. 2. Widespread disillusionment with parliamentarism. 3. The existence of a wide petty bourgeoisie, intermediate strata, slum proletariat, and sections of the workers under capitalist influence. 4. The absence of an independent, class-conscious leadership of the main body of the working class. Are these conditions present in Britain, France, and the United States? The answer must be given that they are all strongly present. If we take Britain first, and ask the question whether there is a basis for fascism in Britain, the consideration of the social forces and structure in the country will show that there is every basis. In the first place, there is a very large proportion of intermediate strata of the population, of petty bourgeois elements, with very narrow and easily controlled political interests, and of a parasitic proletariat closely allied to their masters and virtually unorganizable to the working class movement. Wow, that sounds familiar. This proportion is larger in Britain than in other countries. The 1921 census showed 10 millions of the population engaged in direct productive industries and transport, and 7 millions in, quote, services of very varying degrees of productive value, often of no productive value, but parasitic in character and tied up with the processes of exploitation. Of these 7 millions, over 4 millions are classified under commerce, finance, and personal service. This classification, however, is to some extent misleading without further analysis. More important is the proportion of salaried workers to wage workers. In 1924, according to Bowley and Stamp, in the National Income 1924, published in 1927, the number of salaried workers was 2.8 million against 15.4 million wage earners, or 15% of the employed population. Footnote there, it is noticeable that the proportions of the salariate have considerably increased in the period of the imperialist decline. The 1907 census of production estimated the salaried at 7% and the wage earners at 93%. For 1911, Bowley and Stamp estimated the numbers at 1.6 million and 15.6 million respectively, or over 9% for the salariate. The 1924 figure gives over 15%. The increase between 1911 and 1924 is by more than 1.1 million, or 68%. In the same period, according to this estimate, the number of wage earners decreased by 250,000. Back to the main text. Further, of the wage workers, some 2/3 are unorganized, and these 2/3 are not an outside margin in all industries, but mainly represent the workers outside the big productive industries. At the same time, the Labor Party and trade union leadership, by their denial of the class struggle and preaching of the, quote, community above classes, by their alliance with the employers, Mondism, and capitalism, and by their ban on the United Front, disorganized the independent class action of the workers and paved the way for fascism. An indication of the potential fascist forces is provided by the monster circulations, approaching 2 millions, of journals of the type of the Daily Mail, circulating mainly among petty bourgeois elements, and, in its whole character since its inception, a real forerunner of fascism more than 20 years before the name existed, since 1934, openly fascist. If we turn to the policies and tactics of the bourgeoisie in Britain, it is obvious that these not only do not exclude fascism, but are on the contrary, most closely prepared and adapted for fascism by all the developments of the imperialist period. On the one hand, the state machine, with the famous, quote, unwritten constitution, which can be turned in any direction desired at a moment's notice to suit the emergency needs of the bourgeois dictatorship, is far more exactly fitted than in any democratic republic for all the purposes of intensified dictatorship and fascism. On the other hand, the British bourgeoisie is trained for generations on the basis of its rule of India, Ireland, and the colonial empire to methods of violence and despotic domination, at the same time as on the basis of parliamentary and electioneering humbug in Britain to the technique of mass deception, the two together constituting the perfect combination for fascism. The words of the American ambassador in London during the war years, W. Page, a shrewd and admiring observer on the technique of the diehards, may be recalled, quote, "They call these old Tories diehards. It's a good name. They use military power, social power, financial power, eloquence, learning, boundless impudence, blackguardism, everything to hold what they have, and they fight like tigers, and they tire not," unquote. Or as Lloyd George, the, quote, liberal founder of the Black and Tans, declared in a speech in 1925, quote, "Scratch a conservative and you will find a fascist." For those who are still chloroformed by the sedulously instilled myths of law and order, it would be well to study a little the history of the British bourgeoisie for the past 3 centuries, which in bloody violence could hardly be equaled by any ruling class since the Roman Empire, as well as the action of this same bourgeoisie as a ruling class in the empire outside Britain today. They would speedily learn the mailed fist basis which lies behind the velvet speeches of a Baldwin or a MacDonald. It is sufficient to recall the technique of the Boer War Jingo agitation, the Ulster Rebellion, the Amritsar Massacre, the Black and Tans in Ireland, or the Organization for Countering the General Strike to see the full basis for fascism. So quick comment here, I have seen people on social media trying to say that the United States has always been fascist or something like that, but I think that what Dutt is saying in this passage is probably the best way to understand this. Fascism is a product of the era of imperialism, so it's necessarily tied to the 20th century and that specific stage of capitalism. But yes, the training for it goes back to all of the colonial subjugation and genocide and all of the other violent kinds of domination that have been used to build that system, but which up until this point were not used so much on the major strata of the home population. Capitalism has always been exploitative and oppressive and violent. There's always been social murder and so on, which is to say bad conditions which result in loss of life or shortening of life, etc. But that is not fascism alone. Anyway, continuing. The Ulster movement, with its open defiance of Parliament, organization of private armies, and direct support by the army chiefs, the court, and high society, and ignominious capitulation of the liberal government, is of especial interest as an embryonic precursor of fascism. Lenin wrote of it at the time, quote, "The significance of this revolt of the landlords against the, quote, all-powerful, as the liberal blockheads, especially the liberal scholars, think and have said a million times, English Parliament is extraordinarily great. March 21, 1914 will mark a world historical turning point, when the noble landlords of England, smashing the English Constitution and English law to atoms, gave an excellent lesson in class struggle. These aristocrats behaved like revolutionaries from the right, and by that tore up all conventions, tore down all the veils that prevented the people from seeing the unpleasant, but undoubtedly real, class struggle. That was revealed to all which was formerly concealed by the bourgeoisie and the liberals. The liberals are hypocritical everywhere, but it is doubtful whether their hypocrisy goes to such lengths and to such refinement as in England. Everybody realized that the conspiracy to break the will of Parliament had been long prepared. Real class rule has always been and still lies outside of Parliament. And the petty bourgeois liberals of England and their speeches about reforms and about the power of Parliament, with which they lull the workers, proved to be in fact frauds, straw men put up in order to fool the people, who were quickly torn down by the aristocracy with power in their hands. That's quoting Lenin, The Constitutional Crisis in England, 1914. Indeed, the fascists in Britain today directly look to the Ulster movement as their predecessor. Quote, "Just before the war, the widespread movement directed against Parliament, in sympathy with the Ulster Loyalists, assumed formidable proportions within 2 years of its initiation. That movement, psychologically limited as it was, and directed only to the safeguarding of certain limited objectives, would, had not the war intervened, have developed into a formidable revolt against the whole theory and system of democracy in Britain. The Ulster movement was in fact the first fascist movement in Europe." That's quoting W.E.D. Allen, Fascism in Relation to British History and Character. British Union of Fascists, 1933. If we turn to the United States, an examination of the social composition of the population would also show the basis for fascism. Of the 49 million occupied persons returned in the census of 1930, 19 millions were classified under manufacturing industry, mining and transport, 10 million under agriculture, 6 million under trade, 3 million under the professions, 4 million under clerical occupations, and 5 million under domestic and personal service. In addition to the urban petty bourgeoisie and very wide expansion of the salariat, salesmen, etc., the farming population, with some 6 million separate farms, constitutes roughly 1/4 of the total population. Extreme economic pressure has powerfully radicalized all the poorer farmers, but until a strong proletarian leadership succeeds to establish the alliance, all-powerful once it is achieved, of the industrial workers and small farmers, there is every danger of demagogic fascist movements winning their hold here. At the same time, the organization of the industrial workers is weak. Trade union organization, even after the increases accompanying the present crisis and the Roosevelt codes, which have mainly in fact encouraged company unions, the initial basis for fascist organization in industry, only reaches about 1/5 of the workers. It is mainly confined to the privileged, skilled workers on a craft basis, leaving out the unskilled workers, and, apart from railroads and to some extent mining, has won little hold yet in the basic productive industries. The class collaboration policy of the American Federation of Labor leadership is more open and extreme than in Europe, and still so far opposes any form of political party of the workers, although the development of the crisis may compel a change in this respect. Comment: it's 2024. Has it? Continuing, the reformist labor leaders have taken the role of direct allies and lieutenants of the Roosevelt emergency regime. Here again, therefore, a strong social basis exists for the development of full fascism, if this should become necessary to the bourgeoisie. The traditional tactics and methods of domination of the American bourgeoisie are equally adapted to fascism in proportion as occasion arises. If they have not had the same experience as the British bourgeoisie in the domination of colonial peoples, save more recently and on a smaller scale, they have had plenty of experience in their own domain in the suppression of 12 million Negroes within the United States and of the heavily exploited immigrant populations. The combination of violence, lawlessness, and corruption for the maintenance of capitalist domination has reached classic heights in the United States. It is only necessary to recall the Chicago hangings, Homestead or Dearborn, Sacco Vanzetti or Scottsboro, the exploits of the Pinkerton gangs, the methods in the coal mining and steel areas, the private armies of the employers, the judicial murders, the lynchings and gangsters, the anti-red drive of the Department of Justice after the war, or the waves of sudden expansion of the Ku Klux Klan and similar organizations, to see the plentiful basis for fascism in American bourgeois traditions. If Britain and the United States are both classic lands of semi-fascist methods of bourgeois domination long before fascism, France has long been considered the classic land of, quote, pure democracy. Yet in fact, just the overwhelming petty bourgeois social basis, preponderant small industry and peasantry with a layer of finance capital at the top, but relatively less developed large industry or foreign trade, which underlay the, quote, pure democracy of formal social radical republicanism and actual unlimited corruption and rule of the financial cliques, today, when the new stage develops, becomes equally the basis for fascism. Not only is the majority of the population in France still rural, the proportion of the population in towns of over 5,000 inhabitants was 44% in 1928 as against 54% in Germany, 58% in the United States, and 79% in Britain. But the preponderance of petty industry in the industrial field is still extreme. According to an investigation of Ville-Chabral on the basis of official statistics, see The Economist, September 30, 1933, out of a total of 6,167,647 establishments in 1926, 5,983,075 consisted of 5 persons or less, 2,981,521 single-handed concerns. Out of 17.8 million occupied persons, 11.8 million were occupied in concerns of 5 persons or less, and only 1.5 million workers were employed in concerns of over 500 workers, that is, in large-scale industry. Trade union organization, reaching to a few hundred thousands in each of the 2 rival confederations, is extremely weak, although militant traditions and class consciousness are strongly developed in the big industrial centers. The parliamentary republic has maintained a sometimes precarious hold for 2 generations, but the open reactionary forces which seek to change the regime increase in strength. The experiences of Boulangism, of the anti-Dreyfus agitation, or of the Action Française movement have shown the ground that there is for fascist agitation, and the offensive of the recent fascist demonstrations of the beginning of 1934, leading to the hasty withdrawal of the, quote, left government and installment of a government of national concentration, have shown how rapidly the advance to fascism may develop in France. All this is not to argue that fascism must necessarily develop and conquer in these Western countries. Its success or failure, as in every country, depends on the degree of preparedness and militant resistance of the proletariat. But it is folly to be blind to the reality of the danger, or to the many favoring factors that fascism can marshal to its side in precisely these countries. Above all, it is worse than folly to place a blind confidence, as the liberal and reformist leaders preach, in the, quote, democratic institutions of these countries. The bourgeoisie will use any and every instrument of struggle as occasion arises. It is for the working class and its allies to be prepared for the fight in front. Section 2. The Significance of the National Government in Britain. The development of the world economic crisis has brought a sharp break in the political development in the countries of Western imperialism, and in so doing has brought the question of fascism increasingly to the front also in these countries. In England, the break took place in the autumn of 1931 with the financial crisis and the establishment of the national government. In the United States, the break took place in the spring of 1933 with the inauguration of the Roosevelt regime amid extreme financial crisis and the establishment of emergency powers. In France, where the effects of the economic crisis have operated more slowly, the break came with the Paris revolutionary and counter-revolutionary demonstrations of February 1934 and the formation of the Government of National Concentration under Dumergue. All these reveal a common process of concentration of the bourgeois forces in the crisis, the establishment of intensified forms of dictatorship and emergency powers, the diminution of the role of parliamentarism, and in general, the advance to types of the pre-fascist stage which characterized the Brüning regime in Germany. What was the significance of the formation of the national government in Britain and of the stage of the crisis which gave rise to it? In the first place, it marked the heavy discrediting of the Labour Party. The Labour government, which had been placed in office by 8 million votes on a program of promises of socialism and of the solution of unemployment, had looked on impotently while unemployment rose under its rule from 1.1 millions to 2.7 millions, and had proved itself only the ally of capitalist rationalization against the workers. The hopes which had been preached throughout the post-war period of the peaceful democratic labor path to socialism as the alternative to revolution, and which had won a steadily rising labor vote from 2 millions in 1918 to 8 millions in 1929, received a heavy blow. Disillusionment in the masses was rising, but the Labour Party had in reality represented the safety mechanism of bourgeois rule in the post-war period, like social democracy in Germany, the social conservative force which, while seeming to voice the socialist aspirations of the masses, had served to attach them through parliamentarism to the bourgeois regime. This was now in danger of collapsing and giving place to the rising process of revolutionization. The bourgeoisie was quick to sense the danger. Already in the spring of 1930, Lloyd George voiced the menace to the traditional bourgeois institutions through the discrediting of the Labour Party. Describing how the workers had originally put their hopes in the Liberal Party and lost faith in it, he continued, quote, "Millions consequently threw in their lot with a new party. To them, this party was the party of the last hope. It is now rapidly becoming the party of lost hope. Speakers and agents of all parties returning from the last by-election in a great industrial constituency had the same tale to tell. It was one of the gloom and despair which had fallen on this working-class district owing to the failure of the government they had helped, the last general election, to put into power to bring any amelioration into their conditions and prospects. If Labour fails this time, confidence in parliamentary institutions will for a period disappear in myriads of loyal British homes and hearts." That was quoting Lloyd George's article in the Daily Express, March 18, 1930. The bourgeoisie maneuvered to meet this critical situation. The step, previously only attempted in wartime, was taken of creating a coalition government from all the parties, the national government, under the nominal leadership of MacDonald and Snowden, and under the actual control of conservatism, to win anew the confidence of the masses under this new cover. The maneuver succeeded for the moment by playing on the very intensity of the disgust of the masses with the Labour government. The Labour vote fell for the first time since the war, by the heavy fall of 2 millions. But this disillusionment did not go to the benefit of the small revolutionary vote, which only slightly increased. Many former Labour voters abstained. The benefit of the process of disillusionment went to the national vote, which swept the country with 14.5 millions. It is clear that we have here a special form of the same process which was demonstrated in Germany. The betrayal by social democracy thrusts millions of workers and former petty bourgeois supporters into the reactionary camp, which is skillful to put forward a new flag in order to win them. This is the heart of the process of fascism. It is revealed in its first rudimentary form in the, quote, national maneuver in Britain. The national vote of 1931 was the warning signal of the danger of fascism. Second, the national government marks the process of bourgeois concentration and intensified dictatorship for the carrying through of measures of an increasingly fascist character. The consciousness of this role of the national government, as directly analogous to that of Nazism or fascism, was openly expressed by the Prime Minister, MacDonald, in his speech to the National Labour Committee on November 6, 1933. Quote, "The secret of the successive dictatorships is that they have managed somehow or other to make the soul of a nation alive. We may be shocked at what they're doing, but they have certainly awakened something in the hearts of their people which have given them a new vision and a new energy to pursue national affairs. In this country, the three parties in cooperation are doing that, and our task must be to get the young men with imagination, hope, and vision behind us." Unquote. The national government thus avowedly sets itself the task to achieve the same objects as those of Hitlerism in Germany, whose, quote, dictatorship it publicly praises as representing a, quote, new vision and a new energy to, quote, make the soul of a nation alive. This direct praise of fascism comes from the man who was, until 1931, the accepted leader of the Labour Party, and who indeed gave similar praise to Italian fascism while still leader of the Labour Party. A still more complete and conscious expression of the new policy has been provided in the more recent declarations of the cabinet minister, Elliott, Secretary for Agriculture, a former Fabian. Elliott, who came to the front as the most active exponent of this new economic policy in respect of the whole system of quotas, licenses, subsidies, controlled and restricted production, etc., has increasingly underlined the political significance of the process. In his broadcast speech under the title, Whither Britain, on March 27, 1934, he spoke of the transition to the, quote, new state, of the necessity to, quote, give up a certain amount of liberty, of the need of, quote, economic self-discipline, quote, psychological self-discipline, etc., and directly compared the role of the national government to that of the Hitler government in Germany. Today, Elliott stands out as the principal governmental representative of the new fascist tendency. The development of fascism does not necessarily take the same form in every country. The general tendencies of the new economic and political policies, which receive their most complete expression in fascism, are common in greater or less degree, as has been already pointed out, to all modern capitalism. But the first steps toward fascism commonly develop in and through the decaying forms of the old bourgeois democracy. This is above all the significance of the national government, which itself carries forward tendencies already visible in the whole post-war capitalist development. On the one hand, the national government carries forward the new lines of economic policy, increasing state regulation of production, tariffs, quotas, import boards, the striving toward empire economic unity, and the active increase of war preparations. On the other hand, the national government carries forward the process of the transformation of bourgeois democracy from within, the development of new forms of intensified capitalist dictatorship and increasing restriction of democratic rights. This process is already visible in the whole post-war period, notably in such measures as the Emergency Powers Act and in the Trade Union Act of 1927. It is carried very markedly forward under the national government. This is shown in such measures as 1. The increasing separation of governmental action from parliamentary forms, an extension of government by administrative order or by orders in council. The economy cuts and means test were put through by orders in council and only referred to Parliament after they were already in operation. 2. The reorganization of the police under increasingly centralized and military forms and rapid increase of police expenditure. 3. Increasing restriction of the rights of free speech and assembly, prohibition of meetings, e.g., bannings of meetings of unemployed at labor exchanges, imprisonment without charge of any offense committed, like the Tom Mann case, etc. 4. Active political repression against the workers. In the 2.5 years of the national government up to the spring of 1934, over 1,900 arrests for political offenses have taken place, over 600 sentences for a total of 1,613 months imprisonment, and some 850 fines for a total of £2,540, police interference with strikes, etc. 5. Increasing police violence against the workers, baton charges, etc. 6. The unemployment bill, bringing the unemployed, who have outrun the short period of regular benefit, under the control of a centralized autocratic board, not responsible to Parliament, with power to establish camps and, quote, training centers, or, quote, concentration camps, in the Home Secretary's phrase, subjecting them to a semi-military regime, enforced labor without pay or for purely nominal rates of pay, any worker who resists this slavery and smashing of trade union rates and conditions being liable to be sent to prison. Comment, that's a new one on me, they don't teach you that in school. 7. The incitement to disaffection bill, nominally directed against anti-militarist propaganda, but in fact very much wider and so worded in its original form as presented as to make the mere possession of any revolutionary socialist or anti-war literature an offense punishable with 2 years imprisonment, and giving to the police unlimited powers of search and confiscation. All this may be described as the process of encroaching fascism within the old forms, which precedes and prepares the full fascist attack. An examination of the experience of the Brüning regime in Germany, or of the successive earlier stages of Dollfuss in Austria, when he was still loudly hailed as the, quote, champion of democracy by all the liberal and social democratic forces of the West, will abundantly show the significance of this process, which has definitely begun its first stages in Britain. Section 3. The Roosevelt Emergency Regime. The Roosevelt emergency regime in the United States offers a still clearer demonstration of the whole process. From the moment of his inauguration, the new president demands and is granted emergency powers, quote, as in wartime. Quoting President Roosevelt's inaugural, March 1932, I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage war on the emergency, as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe, unquote. Quoting General H.S. Johnson, speech at Chicago, quote, we do not expect to have to resort to the drastic steps taken during the war, but we have the same kind of a situation, unquote. What is the essence of the New Deal, if we strip from it the sentimental philanthropic ballyhoo? The New Deal, the policy of the Roosevelt regime expressed in the National Industrial Recovery Act and associated measures, represents the most comprehensive and ruthless attempt of finance capital to consolidate its power with the entire strength of the state machine over the whole field of industry, to hold the workers in subjection under extreme and intensified exploitation with a universal lowering of standards, to conduct on this basis, and on the basis of the depreciated dollar, a world campaign for markets, and to prepare directly the consequent inevitable war. The signal marks of the Roosevelt policy are 1. State-controlled capitalism. The process of trustification in the United States was previously still hampered by the remains of the old antitrust legislation surviving from the pre-war epoch. The New York correspondent of the London Times, June 6, 1933, stated the first and principal reason for big business support of the Industrial Recovery Act. Quote, what big business desires above all things is relief from the antiquated antitrust laws, unquote. By one stroke, all antitrust legislation is swept away. The preamble of the Industrial Recovery Act openly proclaims the aim, quote, to remove obstructions to the free flow of interstate commerce, which tend to diminish the amount thereof, and to promote the organization of industry for the purpose of cooperative action among trade groups, unquote. A gigantic process of consolidation of the big monopolies and extermination of the small producers and independent firms in the leading industries. Quote, 10 million retailers protest against the Blue Eagle. They maintain that they cannot do business on a basis of shorter hours, more wages, and practically the same prices. Quoting the Daily Telegraph, August 25, 1933. Already begun by the effects of the crisis, the credit smash, and the operations of the Reconstruction Finance Corporation, is now carried to its logical conclusion. Every leading industry is established under direct state organization, with regulation of labor conditions, price fixing, restriction of production, and guaranteed profits. This is the ideal of capitalist society in decay, seeking to chain the productive forces which have outgrown capitalism. 2. Inflation. The ostensible purpose of inflation is proclaimed as to give a stimulus to recovery, a stimulus whose artificial character is rapidly revealed, as in the heavy decline in the autumn of 1933 following the short-lived summer boom, and to relieve and reduce the load of debts of agriculture and industry, which were threatening to bring the whole structure crashing. Its actual operation reveals it as one of the familiar weapons of finance capitalist brigandage in periods of crisis. It means in the first place a direct robbery of all small owners and of all small savings, the partial expropriation of the petty bourgeoisie. Second, it serves as the basis for colossal share speculations and manipulations, as well as processes of price raising for the profit of finance capital. Third, it effects a universal reduction of the real wages of all workers, such as to make the guaranteed wage standards, already fixed at very low levels, in practice the cover for a general lowering of wage standards, as even the American Federation of Labor has now begun to complain. Fourth, it opens the way in the international sphere to a price-cutting campaign on the basis of the depreciated dollar, to wipe out competitors and swamp the already depressed world markets. 3. Servitude and intensified exploitation of labor. The new industrial codes establish an authoritative regime of the subjection of the worker under the direct union of the employers and the state, with government-fixed wages, hours, and conditions of labor, virtually compulsory arbitration by the government, and increasingly open offensive on the right to strike and on independent workers' organization. While the social fascist organs are drawn directly into the governmental apparatus, a full offensive is let loose on all independent militant unions. The inauguration of the new industrial regime is accompanied by the shooting of miners on strike in western Pennsylvania and the proclamation of martial law against strikers in Utah and New Mexico. Quote, "The AFL has voluminous evidence," declared its president, William Green, on January 15, 1934, at a hearing on the Lumber Code, that drastic reduction has taken place in the wages of skilled workers since the adoption of the code, and that the minimum wages tended to become the maximum wages paid. Unquote. In the name of the NRA, the employers endeavored to proclaim all strikes and picketing illegal. At the same time, in the labor camps, some 350,000 young workers are placed under semi-military conditions. 4. War preparations. The Industrial Recovery Act specifically provides for the building of, quote, Navy vessels, airplanes, and mechanization or motorization of the Army tactical units, unquote. $235 million of the special appropriations for public works are devoted to the Navy. The Secretary for the Navy, Swanson, states, quote, "I know of no more effective and praiseworthy way of giving our industrial life that countrywide stimulus which it so sorely needs, and by devoting a portion of the money and energy which is to be used for public construction to this vital arm of our national defense." It's quoted from the New York Times, June 16, 1933. The war character of the whole system of state organization, mobilization of industry, and semi-conscription of labor is obvious. To what outcome does the new American system lead? The economic outcome can be no more successful in solving the crisis than the similar methods of fascism elsewhere. The emptiness of all the promises of renewed prosperity, of the solution of unemployment, and of the achievement of higher standards all around has already been demonstrated. The speculative production boom of the summer of 1933 only led to a small increase in employment, and yet was followed by a rapid collapse, showing the impossibility of absorbing the present increased productive power under existing conditions, save through the final, quote, solution of war. The Federal Reserve Board Index of Industrial Production, reduced to the base of 1928 as 100, which rose from 54.1 in March 1933 to 90.1 in July, fell to 65.8 in November, and had only risen to 68.5 by January 1934. The stagger system of reducing the nominal figure of unemployment, as in Germany, by spreading the existing employment, means no real increase in the volume of employment. The civil works schemes, while pouring out colossal sums of money to give temporary employment and thus assisting the process of inflation, only intensify the problem when, owing to the enormous rising volume of debt, they have to be diminished and come to an end, throwing millions again into the unemployed, while no permanent channels of employment have been found. The level of real wages has been lowered owing to the rapid rise in prices. The American Federation of Labor is compelled to report in its official organ in January 1934, quote, "Since the bank crisis, the average worker's weekly income has risen 7.4% to October. But prices the worker has to pay for his living expenses have risen much more than this." Comment, we're just covering a very similar thing about the last 3 years in live stream number 117. Continuing, food prices are up 18% to November 21st. Prices of clothing and furnishings are up 26.3% to November. Thus, the worker who had a job right along is worse off than he was when the year began. His pay envelope may be larger, but it buys less. His real wage is smaller. Unquote. In January 1934, the president of the American Federation of Labor, William Green, complained that there were still nearly 12 million workers not absorbed into normal employment, and that, quote, workers are steadily losing by price increases, unquote, or inflation. Continuing to quote, "Our estimate shows that there are 11,690,000 persons wanting work but unable to find employment in our normal industrial production services. Unemployment is still above the 1932 level by 1.5 million. Workers are steadily losing by price increases, and we must expect their living standards to be further reduced as prices go on upward," unquote. But while all the social reformist, quote, progressive camouflage of the Roosevelt New Deal thus rapidly fades away, the reality of the new fascist type of system of concentrated state capitalism and industrial servitude remains. As Roosevelt declared in his message to Congress in January 1934, quote, "We have created a permanent feature of our modernized industrial structure, and it will continue under the supervision, but not the arbitrary dictation, of the government itself," unquote. Roosevelt's Secretary for Agriculture, Wallace, still further brought out the implications of this process in his pamphlet entitled America Must Choose, issued in the spring of 1934. In this pamphlet, in the course of which he advocates that America must, quote, "annually and permanently retract of our good agricultural land some 25 million acres," unquote, he states, quote, "The new types of social control that we have now in operation are here to stay, and to grow on a world or national scale. As yet, we have applied in this country only the barest beginnings of the sort of social discipline which a completely determined nationalism requires. We must be ready to make sacrifices to a known end," unquote. The significance of the Roosevelt regime is above all the significance of the transition to fascist forms, especially in the economic and industrial field. As the associate editor of the Current History magazine of the New York Times, E.F. Brown writes, quote, "The new America will not be capitalist in the old sense, nor will it be socialist. If at the moment the trend is toward fascism, it will be an American fascism, embodying the experience, the traditions, and the hopes of a great middle-class nation," unquote. But in fact, this stage is still a transition. As the failure of the plans of economic recovery becomes manifest and gives place to new forms of crisis and widespread mass discontent, and above all, as the advance to war implicit in the whole Roosevelt policy develops, the demand for corresponding political forms of fascism will come to the front in the United States.